What is the Westminster Confession of Faith, and why should it matter to you? What happens when the government calls together over 100 of the greatest theologians of the day, not to start a denomination, but to reform an entire nation's church? The Westminster Confession of Faith is a key document in Presbyterian theology written in the 17th century by a group of English and Scottish theologians. It serves as a primary summary of biblical doctrine and a standard for church teaching. So first, let's examine the historical context. 17th century England. This is going to be the 1600s. There's much political turmoil. England is fractured by the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651. It's a power struggle between the Parliament and King Charles I at this time. So in 1643, Parliament calls together the Westminster Assembly to reform church doctrine, liturgy, and church governance. Basically, the church has gotten together to tell the government, hey, what do we believe? More so, the government has called on the church to say, church, what do you believe? So this is then written and compiled between 1643 and 1647. And it's presented to Parliament the following year in 1648. One scholar, Chad Van Dixum, notes that the assembly was not an independent ecclesiastical council, but it was a tool of Parliament, though one that resisted political pressure. We also see there's some religious division like I alluded to earlier. Anglicans, Puritans, Presbyterians, and even Independents are all vying for control of the Church of England. Now, we've used this term historically. Many have heard of the Westminster Divines. What does this mean? Does it mean that these guys are gods? Does it mean that, man, they have a special seat just because they are the Westminster Divines? No. The usual answer would be it's just akin to reverend. It would be a Westminster reverend, in more so the modern vernacular. But there's a bit more to this. Divine was actually meant to refer to one who divined, or who thoroughly searched out the will of God in the Scriptures. You see, the Westminster Assembly was super focused on doing that. And like we mentioned prior, in the midst of great necessity to reform the church back to that of the apostles. The word divine is merely an archaic word for theologian. If one would reference their King James Bible, reading the title of Revelation, it would say Saint John the Divine. This is why a student of theology actually seeks a degree in divinity, not necessarily reverendry or, say, honorability. So, second, who were the divines? This was 121 ministers, 30 lay assessors, and some Scottish commissioners. Basically what this means is you have your ministers, who are your pastors, your lay assessors, who are generally your non-teaching church elders, members, ruling elders who would help out, and then Scottish commissioners, who are delegates sent from the Church of Scotland to consult and not necessarily do the voting. Most of the 121 were Puritan pastors. These would be those deeply committed to the Reformed theological tradition, deeply committed to reforming the church in England here. And of the groups, the Scottish commissioners, like I said, didn't even vote. They're not necessarily from England, so if they're being advised by Parliament, they shouldn't. Though they advised and they helped much. Like one of the Westminster Divines, one of my favorites being Samuel Rutherford. We'll talk about him a little bit more later. So the Scottish commissioners, this is kind of how Presbyterianism spreads past Scotland, is their involvement here. It's why Presbyterians have much of a Scottish root. And then the international cooperation of Reformed churches during the Reformation should also be seen here. And then next, we see that the Westminster Standards weren't just an English product. This was not just the government said, hey, here's what we do. It's that they were shaped uniquely and significantly by Scottish theological convictions and ecclesiastical priorities. So in terms of even in modern application, the Scottish commissioners are the perfect example of how faith, theology, and politics come together in real life, and how young, bold voices like that of, say, a George Gillespie, a Scottish firebrand, and one of the youngest members, if not the youngest in the assembly, can make a long-lasting impact on a nation's theology and even the world. Some very notable people were, like I mentioned, George Gillespie or Thomas Goodwin, who would have been an independent. But my favorite Westminster divine is Samuel Rutherford. This would have been a Scottish commissioner. A fun fact, the Westminster Assembly actually met 1,100 times across nearly 10 years. So, in that time, what did they produce? One, the Westminster Confession of Faith. This was a detailed articulation of Reformed theology, going from one concept to another. Say things like justification or baptism. What does baptism do? What is it about? The shorter catechism was the next thing they made. And then the larger catechism. Shorter would have been probably 1647 and larger 48, but shorter would have been for educating children and families, and larger would have been more exhaustive. This would have been used in pulpits and for elder training. So, for example, the catechism, shorter catechism would have questions like, what is the chief end of man? To which the answer would be, man's chief end is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That'd be question 1 of the shorter catechism. But these documents became the constitutional standard for the global Reformed Church at that point. It starts to spread out. But first, the Church of Scotland. So the Reformed standard went from being the historic creeds, and they maintain the historic creeds like that of the Nicene Creed. But we see a push to the world now, not necessarily of Scotland being the constitutional standard, but Presbyterian and Reformed churches. Churches we will eventually see pop up in the American Revolution. But within this, what are the key doctrines and theological contributions? So one would be Scripture as the ultimate authority. This idea of a sola scriptura. This is that the whole counsel of God, right? Westminster talks about this. It quoted as saying, it is either expressly set down in Scripture or by good and necessary consequence may be deduced from Scripture. The divines were very clear in what they're recapitulating to Parliament, that the authority for them is the Bible. No time today, but Scroll of Scriptura was not even new to the Reformers. They're just taking this together. It can be seen in some of the early church fathers, but it is bolstered and sort of comes back into vogue in a major way here. Secondly, we also see God's sovereignty and predestination, particularly, say, chapter 3, that God chooses who he will save, and he draws them to himself, that salvation is not on our part. This is the core tenet of Presbyterian soteriology. Third, that covenant theology, the emphasis on God's dealings through covenants, is essential. Not necessarily for salvation, but for a true understanding of the Bible. This being, say, chapter 7 of the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is that the Bible's meta-narrative is seen in the context of God's promises to his people. Then fourth, Christ as the mediator, being chapter 8. This is an emphasis on Christ being the true and perfect substitutionary sacrifice, being fully God and fully man, and doing what man could never do. Then last, sanctification by faith alone. There are more in here, but we see that's kind of 14 through 16. That is combating even a cultural Christianity of their own time that we could learn. Structure, clarity, and deep biblical grounding made this a theological benchmark that it still is today. Though some controversies and divergences, they come about. Say Mark Dever with a really good book, Why Baptists Don't Use the Westminster Confession, but also we see the historical comparisons that the London Baptist Confession is formed after the Westminster Confession of Faith. Even for them, it is the bar by which they measure where they don't agree with. And not all Protestants accept the Westminster Standards. We're going to see it primarily in Presbyterian, Reformed, and even some more evangelical churches. But that historic Protestantism, if they're not holding to the 39 Articles, there is a good chance that 39 Articles being Anglican, they're going to be holding to the Westminster Confession of Faith. Baptists adapt it, like I said, into the London Confession 1989 to reflect believers' baptism in a sort of congregational polity. Critics would argue over the Sabbath doctrine, what day is the Lord's and what we do during it, or what day should we specifically set apart for worship. Views on, say, civil magistrate and even church discipline arise. But even so, the enormous influence cannot be ignored. I would go so far as to make claims that America as a concept would not have even happened before and without the Westminster Divines. More on that on a future video, though, particularly of Rutherford. But fourth, why the Westminster Confession still matters. So it happened a long time ago. What does it have to do with you or I? Well, for one, it's adopted by Presbyterian denominations worldwide. PCA, OPC, the Free Church of Scotland. It's what I would absolutely subscribe to as a clear, systematic way of understanding everything from doctrine to church polity, at least at a 30,000-foot view. Man, these guys met 1,100 times to discuss these things. I mean, if anything, it's pertinent to you because it's used in seminaries, in elder training, in church membership. That if you're at a Reformed church, it is what your leaders believe. Maybe broader than that, it offers a robust biblical theology, especially useful in understanding salvation, defending orthodoxy or right and true historic Christianity, teaching doctrine with clarity. And then catechisms, they're still used today to teach children and new believers, and they should be used more, I contend. And last and maybe most importantly, because it's true. Truths transcend time and they honor God. Kevin DeYoung says, it's not just a historical document, it's a living standard for the confession of Christian faith in the Reformed tradition. I contend that we must reclaim these roots of our tradition because they're wonderful. The Westminster Confession wasn't written to be trendy, it was written to be timeless, rooted in Scripture, forged in conflict, and still guiding the church nearly 400 years later. If you found the video helpful, please comment your favorite catechism question or doctrine. Any questions for me, I would love to respond to. Tell me, do you agree? Do you disagree? What did you find helpful? What did you not? Want to read the confession? There is a link in the description of this video. Please subscribe for more church history and theological content. Until next time, I am Gabe Holcomb with Reformed Reason, and I'll see you next time.